Thank you very much, Jeff. And, thank you all for coming out tonight. I've enjoyed being here so far and enjoyed preparing this lecture on the King James Bible, something that is obviously an enormous cultural artifact and is worth our attention and this exhibition that you have here at LMU. So my talk is what kind of text is the King James Bible, manuscripts, translation, and the legacy of the King James Version. I want to start by talking about a very brief history of Bible translation, and to begin that, to talk about my first interest in Bible translation. About 25 years ago, before I started teaching at Chapel Hill, I was working for my mentor, Bruce Metzger, who, as Jeff said, was one of the great textual scholars of the 20th century. And he, among other things, was the chairman of the committee that was preparing the new Revised Standard Version of the Bible, which is a standard translation that a lot of people use today. And when I graduated from my PhD program with him, he asked me if I would serve as his research assistant for the NRSV translation. And so I did research for a couple of years with Metzger in preparation for this translation that was coming out. In the office that I had there at Princeton Seminary, at the library, Spear Library at Princeton Seminary, while working for the NRSV, there was a metal box that was sitting on the bookshelf that Metzger loved to show people and tell about. Inside this box were ashes. And the deal was this. In 1952, the Revised Standard Version of the Bible was published, and many conservative Christians thought that it was filled with heresy because they had mistranslated important passages, and that this translation, the RSV, was in fact inspired by the devil. And so there was a pastor in North Carolina, where I now live, who took a copy of the RSV in the pulpit and took a blowtorch and announced this publicly before he did this, so he'd get a big crowd, and he attacked it with the blowtorch. And as it turns out, it's hard to get a Bible to burn. Not because it's a Bible, but just because it's a book with hard covers. And it's hard to get. And so he had this blowtorch going, and it wasn't working. And he finally says, well, it's like the devil. It's hard to burn. And so finally the thing caught fire, and it burned. And he collected the ashes, and he sent them to the chair of the RSV Bible Translation Committee, saying, this is what I think of your Bible. So Metzger would always show off this box of ashes, and then he would say that he's glad that in the modern period that it's only a copy of the translation that gets burned rather than the translator, since he was the translator for the RSV. So yes, so in the modern period, sometimes people burn translations, but in fact, at one point, they did burn translators. The first translator of the Bible into English was William Tyndale. And he was, in fact, burned at the stake for his efforts. He wasn't the first to translate the Bible into English per se. The first to do this was John Wycliffe, or at least the followers of John Wycliffe in 1382. And you're going to have, there's going to be another session devoted to the Wycliffite Bible here as part of the series that I'm sure will be extremely interesting. Wycliffe translated the Latin Bible into English. And so the deal is this. The Christian Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, is written in Hebrew, and the New Testament is written in Greek. But throughout the history of the Western Church, the Bible that people used was the Latin translation that had been done back in the 4th century, starting with the great scholar Jerome. And so the Roman Catholic Church historically had used the Latin Bible. So Wycliffe, or at least his followers, translated the Latin Bible into English in the 14th century, 1382. And this caused a lot of Roman Catholics to be upset. A lot of Roman Catholic clerics didn't want the Bible available to people in their native language because they weren't sure what use they would put the Bible to. And so they wanted to be able to tell them what was in the Bible and what the Bible meant without people reading it for themselves. And so they got upset about this Wycliffite Bible. And there was a convention in Oxford in 1408, obviously in England, where there was a policy passed that said that nobody could translate the Bible into English anymore without being authorized by the church, so that they wouldn't allow Bible translation. And this became the law of the land in England in the early 15th century. When Tyndale came along in the early 16th century, he decided that, in fact, he wanted the Bible available to people, that he didn't want it simply to be available to the clergy. He wanted people to be able to read it, and he wanted them to read a translation that was made from the original Hebrew and Greek, not simply from the Latin Vulgate. He was trained in Greek, as most people were at that time, starting soon before that at Oxford. So he could read Greek well, and he picked up Hebrew as well, and so he started translating the Bible. He translated the entire New Testament, and in the process of doing this, he knew he wouldn't be welcomed in England, so he actually had to go over to Germany to do it. And he translated the New Testament. He ended up being betrayed and thrown in jail. He translated the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, and in jail he translated Joshua to 2nd Chronicles. So he translated about half of the Hebrew Bible. But he ended up, as I said, being betrayed. He was in jail. They ended up executing him for violating this law of 1408, and so he was burned at the stake in 1536. And so that's what happened to the first Bible translator, William Tyndale. After Tyndale, what a lot of people don't realize is that the King James Version was not the first English translation. Tyndale's was, and it wasn't the first one after Tyndale. There were a number of translations that were done. There were 7 major translations after Tyndale, but the most important ones were one by a companion of his, Miles Coverdale, who did a translation in 1535 that was, in fact, accepted in England, even though Tyndale ended up being executed the next year for doing exactly the same thing. The Great Bible, that was also done by this guy, Miles Coverdale. And these are entire Bibles. So Tyndale didn't get through the entire Bible because he got killed first, but these are entire Bibles. The Great Bible is called the Great Bible not because everybody thought it was so great, but because it was enormous. And so it was designed for churches, so you'd have a big Bible up there in church so people could read it. There's a Bible called the Geneva Bible in 1560, which was it's called the Geneva Bible because Protestants who were in exile from England had gone to Geneva, and they decided they wanted to do a new translation of the Bible. And they did this translation in which they put a lot of marginal notes where they lambasted the Catholic Church. These were Protestants who really didn't like the Catholic Church, and among other things, they had marginal notes that indicated that the Roman Catholic Pope was the Antichrist of 666 of the book of Revelation, and other things that didn't make them very popular with their Catholic friends and neighbors. Finally, there was a bishop's Bible done in 1568 by a group of bishops. These 2 Bibles here, the Geneva Bible and the Bishop's Bible, were the first Bibles done by committee. Today, almost all Bible translations are done by committee. And there are different opinions about that, about whether that's a good thing or not. Some people think that really what a better thing is to have somebody's individual genius come through in a translation, and other people think that it's better to have a committee because that way you can sort of get rid of the idiosyncrasies of any particular translator. But sometimes translation by committee doesn't go so well because it's like writing a memo by committee. You get the kind of the lowest common denominator. It's not so great. Well, the thing about all of these Bibles is that even though they're separate translations, all of them were heavily dependent on Tyndale's translation. And that, of course, that is what we're going to see with the King James Bible as well. So let me say something about where the King James Bible came from. King James became the king of England in the early 17th century. He had been the King of Scotland, and he was related by blood to Queen Elizabeth, and he became the king. And one of the big problems that Elizabeth had faced during her reign was that the Puritans in the English church didn't like very well the established church. That they thought that the established church, with its bishops and its ceremonies and its rituals, were not really what religion was supposed to be all about. And so Puritans were sort of like really hyper-Protestants. And in the Church of England, you also had people who were very traditional. And the Puritans and the traditionalists were at each other's throats. And so King James, who was concerned about such things, called a conference at a palace at Hampton Court, which is just outside of London, on the southwest side of London. It was a palace built by Henry VIII. And he had this Hampton Court conference in order to have the Puritans and the traditionalists figure out how to get along with each other. Well, so they had these debates, and it didn't go too well for the Puritans. But at the end of these debates, somebody one of the Puritans suggested, we need a new translation of the Bible. They wanted a new translation of the Bible because they didn't like the bishop's Bible that had been around. But James was actually on the side of the traditionalists. And he liked the idea of a new translation because he thought if we get a new translation, he could quiet these Puritans, who were the ones who wanted the translation. And so he agreed to the new translation, but thinking that this would be a way of promoting the cause of the traditionalists. And so he made it happen. There were 6 committees appointed. Mainly these were people who taught at Oxford and Cambridge, the 2 universities in England at the time. They formed 6 committees, 2 of which met at Oxford, Cambridge, and then in London at Westminster. There are questions among scholars about how many people actually participated in the translation, but the best guess is that there were 47 translators who were all skilled, highly skilled, in Greek and Hebrew. Today, when somebody's highly skilled in Greek, like Jeff Syker and me, we're considered highly skilled in Greek. That means we can kind of slosh our way through a Greek text if we have a good dictionary sitting next to us. These guys, including King James, could speak Greek and did speak Greek to each other when they felt like it. And they could read Hebrew like the newspaper. So, I mean, these were serious scholars who, their excuses, they didn't have TV, there was no ESPN, what did they do? They sit around and they studied Greek. I mean, this is what they did. And so and Latin and Hebrew and they had 6 committees in these places, and they started the translation. All of the people on these committees were church people. They were either Puritans or many of them were bishops or had some kind of connection, official connection with the church. It took them 7 years. It was finished in 1611. It was called the Authorized Version. In America, we call it the King James Bible. In England, they call it the Authorized Version, although authorized is a bit of a misnomer because the King James never really officially authorized the translation, and it was never authorized by an act of parliament or anything else, but the people who translated it considered it to be authorized, and so they call it the Authorized Version. One of the striking things about this Authorized Version, the King James Version, is just how much it is reliant on earlier translations, especially the translation of Tyndale. This reliance, in fact, is admitted by the translators. In the preface of the 1611 edition of the King James Bible, it says, "Truly good Christian reader, we never thought," this is the translators talking, "from the beginning that we should need to make a new translation, but to make a good translation better, or out of many good ones, make one principal good one. That hath been our endeavor." And so they're admitting that they're not, in fact, ignoring what the other translations have done. They're going to consult those as well as look at the Hebrew and the Greek. What they don't tell you is that they basically ripped off the Tyndale translation. So the reality is that the King James Version is technically it's a revision of the Bishop's Bible. The Bishop's Bible was a revision of the Great Bible, and the Great Bible was a revision of Tyndale. In the exhibit out here, in the exhibit in the room in here where they've got the Bibles and things, one of the very telling exhibits is they have a passage from Matthew chapter 5 in the Tyndale Bible, in the Geneva Bible, and in the King James Bible. Just look at them and see how similar they are. The best guesstimates are that the King James Bible in the New Testament reproduces Tyndale's words in 92% of the cases. 92% of the words are simply taken from Tyndale. So, people celebrate the King James as being the greatest, and it is. I mean, I will go on to say it is the great classic of American literature, of English literature. It's a great classic of English literature, but the genius goes back to Tyndale, and this isn't often enough acknowledged by people who celebrate the King James, not realizing that, in fact, these translators had predecessors. I should say, by the way, that most of the Bibles that are used today, not most of the Bibles, the New Revised Standard Version that I did research for was a revision of the 1952 Revised Standard Version that the guy took the blowtorch to. The Revised Standard Version was a revision of the 1901 American Standard Version, which was a revision of the 1881 Revised Version, which was a revision of the King James, which is a revision of Tyndale. It all goes back to Tyndale. When they were doing the NRSV, by the way, one of the things people don't recognize is how do you come up with a name for a new translation? And so when I sat in on the committee meetings for the NRSV, they debated, what are we going to call this thing? They ended up calling it the NRSV, but there were other options. The one that I really hoped they would go for, that I thought they were going to go for, is that since it was the translation, it was a revision of the RSV, I was hoping they would go with the RSVP. They didn't do it. They didn't suggest it, though. All right, so let me talk about the King James Version and the many virtues of the King James Version. And there are indeed many virtues of the King James Bible. For one thing, there are very, very memorable passages. Passages that people who know their Bibles, these passages, they just sound right. They sound like the Bible. Let me give you some examples. Genesis chapter 1. This is from the King James. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. You know, you can argue that nobody's done it better than that. That is very good. Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. And so on. Very familiar, very moving and powerful. Isaiah chapter 40, verses 3 to 5. The voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low. And the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. Move into the New Testament. For example, the passage that's in the room over here, the Beatitudes from the Gospel of Matthew. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. And the last example, the Gospel of John. chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Well, these are very powerful ways of phrasing the biblical text. They're direct. They are rhetorically effective. The schemes of the scanning schemes work very well. They're just very moving and powerful. So the King James is, for this reason, has been one of the great classics of the English language that people should read for the sake of the language, I think. There are not only memorable passages in the King James, there are memorable phrases that have become virtually common phrases in the English language. Genesis 4, am I my brother's keeper? Matthew 5, the salt of the earth. Matthew 18, where 2 or 3 are gathered together. Matthew 26, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Luke 12, my favorite, eat, drink, and be merry. Romans 2, a law unto themselves. Romans 13, the powers that be. James 5, the patience of Job. Phrase after phrase, the King James have come into the English language and are phrases that we now use in completely different contexts just because they're such memorable phrases. The impact on the English language has been enormous. Many people argue that Shakespeare is the most influential individual on the English language, and I think that's probably right. If you look at the number of words that Shakespeare introduced into the English language, it's some phenomenal number, and there's no doubt that Shakespeare has had probably the largest impact on the English language. But I would argue that William Tyndale is a close second, because the King James Bible has made such an enormous impact on the English language and the way we speak the language, the way we understand the language, and it's getting a lot of these words from Tyndale. So in some respects, it's Tyndale who's made the impact, but it's directly through the King James Bible. And so there is no doubt that the King James Bible is one of the great literary productions of Western civilization. So I think that is an absolute certainty. That's not to say that the King James Bible is without its problems. There are people today who think that the King James Bible is the only acceptable translation of the Bible. Now, most of the people who feel that way know nothing about the actual history of how the book was put together. And I would suggest that people who think that really should read up on the history of the King James Bible to see how it was put together. And one of the books on display out here for sale that I did not write, but I have read, is by the same name, Manifold Greatness. And it's a great little introduction to how the King James Bible came about. That'd be worth reading if you want to see how the King James Bible was put together. There are problems with the King James Bible, I think. All right, so the other two problems in the text are the theological biases of the translators and the textual basis of the translation. So let me say something about the theological biases of the translators that sometimes got in the way of the translation, in my opinion. I'll give you just 2 examples of this. Daniel chapter 3:25. Daniel 3 is this famous story about these 3 Israelite men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refused to worship a statue of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will not worship the statue because they're faithful to God. And they're not going to worship anyone except for God. But there's a law of the land that if anyone doesn't worship the statue of of Nebuchadnezzar, they'll be thrown into a fiery furnace. And so they refuse. Nebuchadnezzar gets ticked off, and he has the furnace heated up to 7 times its normal heat. They take Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they bind them, they throw them in the furnace. And the furnace is so hot that it kills the people who throw them in. But then Nebuchadnezzar looks in the furnace, and he sees there's a 4th figure in there. And the King James says that he sees walking with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the Son of God. Now, of course, any Christian reader is going to read that and assume that Jesus is in there with them. But the Hebrew doesn't actually say the Son of God. It's not Hebrew, it's Aramaic at this point. It says a son of the gods, meaning some kind of angelic being. But it's not talking about the Son of God, Jesus. This is importing Jesus into the Old Testament, which is a theological move. So you might want to interpret it that it's really Jesus in there, but it's not what the text says. Okay, so you see what I mean? It's kind of subtle, but it ends up mattering. An even more important case is in the book of Isaiah, chapter 7, verse 14. So this takes a little bit longer to unpack. So the deal's this. Isaiah was a man living in the 8th century BCE who was a prophet, who was a kind of advisor to the king Ahab. Ahab? Ahaz. Who knows? Depends which Bible you're reading. King Ahab. And Ahab is upset because 2 foreign countries have attacked him. The northern country of Israel and the country of Syria have attacked Judah and have laid siege to Jerusalem. And Isaiah tells the king that he doesn't need to worry about these 2 kings that have attacked him because God's going to take care of the situation. And the king says, "How will I know?" And Isaiah says that God will give you a sign. A virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call him Emmanuel. That's the King James translation of it. And then he goes on to say, before the child is very old, he'll be able to eat honey and curds, and these 2 kingdoms will go back and not bother you anymore. Now, the point of this passage is that some woman's going to get pregnant or is pregnant already and is going to give birth, and before the child gets very old, the problem will pass away. Okay? But in the King James translation, it's translated, a virgin shall conceive. That gets quoted in the New Testament by the Gospel of Matthew as a reference to Jesus. A virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call him Emmanuel. In the book of Matthew in the New Testament, quoting Isaiah chapter 7. Now, this is complicated, but when Matthew is quoting Isaiah, he's not quoting the Hebrew of Isaiah, he's quoting the ancient Greek translation of Isaiah, which does use the word virgin. But the Hebrew Bible, that is the base for the Greek translation and for the King James Version, doesn't say virgin. In the Hebrew Bible, it says, a young woman has conceived and will bear a son. The Hebrew word is alma, a young woman. It's not Bethula, which means a virgin. And so there's nothing in this passage about the woman being a virgin. She's a young woman. And that makes perfect sense in the context of Isaiah. A young woman will conceive or has conceived, and by the time her son is old enough, these kings are going to disappear. Well, the King James translators are being influenced by their knowledge of the quotation of this passage in Matthew and by their belief that Jesus was born of a virgin, and so they put it back onto Isaiah even though it wasn't originally there. See what I mean? So it's a bias of the translator that's affecting the translation. And so in most modern translations today, Isaiah 7:14 will be translated, a young woman will conceive or has conceived and will bear a son. Whereas in Matthew, of course, it's translated virgin because that's the word that's used there. All right, so anyway, so that's a case where you're not really seeing what Isaiah had to say. because the translator's bias has gotten in the way. Finally, the textual basis of the translation. This is the third problem. I'll just do these, just mention these problems that tend to be in the New Testament. And just to give you the brief story of this, which is, since 1611, a lot of manuscripts have been discovered of the New Testament, Greek manuscripts. The New Testament was originally written in Greek, it was copied in Greek, and copies of those copies were copied over the years, over the centuries. Today we have something like 5,600 copies of the New Testament in Greek. The King James translation was based on like 8 or 10. And the 8 or 10 they used weren't very good. Now, it's all they had available to them. But since then, we've discovered thousands. But it means that we know more what the original text said, because of these thousands, they're all different from each other. They have different wording here and there in the other place. And these few that were available to the King James translators were not very early. They were ancient. I mean, they were not very ancient. And in some places, they had mistakes in them from copies making mistakes. This led to a lot of problems. Here's one of the key ones. 1 John chapter 5, verses 7 and 8. This is called the Johannine Comma. I don't know why they call it. So Johannine, because it's in the book of 1 John, comma means just a phrase, a short phrase, or a part of a sentence. And so this is an important passage because it's the only passage in the New Testament that explicitly affirms the doctrine of the Trinity. It's the only passage in the New Testament that explicitly affirms the doctrine of the Trinity. There are passages that mention Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but this passage actually states the doctrine itself, as I will read to you from the King James. 1 John 5. So, King James, 1 John 5, verses 7 and 8. There are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one. Okay, there you got it. Three that bear witness. There are three divine beings, but there's only one. Three persons, one Godhead. That's the Trinity. So that's how the King James translates that verse. Now, when the King James translators were translating their New Testament, they were not actually looking at the manuscripts themselves, these 8 or 10 manuscripts. They were looking at a book that had printed the New Testament based on these few manuscripts. The book was produced by the great scholar named Erasmus, who was a scholar who produced editions of books based on the ancient Greek. Erasmus was the first to publish a Greek New Testament in printed form. Over the centuries, people had copied them by hand. Printing was invented in the 15th century. Erasmus was the first to produce a printed Greek New Testament. And in his printed Greek New Testament, he didn't have that verse. They had the Trinity in it. And the reason was because the manuscript he used for 1 John didn't have the verse in it. Well, so what happened was Erasmus's version didn't have it, and people got really upset because they said, "You took out the Trinity." And Erasmus said, "I didn't take out the Trinity, it wasn't in my Greek manuscript." And he said, "I looked at other Greek manuscripts, they don't have it either." But it was in the Latin Vulgate. It was in the Latin, and so they said, "But it's, it should be in there." And Erasmus apparently said, "If you can find me a Greek manuscript with that verse in it, I'll put it in my next edition." And so they produced a manuscript. In fact, they literally produced a manuscript. Apparently what happened is somebody copied it out in Greek, and when they got to this passage, they translated the Latin into Greek and put the verse in. And so Erasmus, who agreed to put it in his next edition, put it in his next edition, and so now the verse is in his second edition. And that's the edition that's the basis for the King James translation. So that's why it made it into English. See, it's because because of this deal with Erasmus. So the verse actually is not originally part of 1 John. It was added later, but if you read the King James Bible, you would think it was in there. Okay, a couple other instances that are not as complicated. The woman taken in adultery. This is the famous passage in the Gospel of John where Jesus is teaching in the temple, and they drag this woman in front of him. The Jewish authorities drag this woman before him, and they say she's been caught in the act of adultery, and according to the law of Moses, she's to be stoned to death. What do you say we should do? Well, this is setting a trap for Jesus, because if he says, well, yeah, stone her, then he's breaking his own teachings about love and forgiveness and mercy. But if he says, no, let her go, then he's breaking the law of Moses. So what's he supposed to do? Well, as you know, Jesus always has a way of getting out of these traps. And this time what he does is he stoops down, he starts writing on the ground. He looks up and he says, let the one without sin among you be the first to cast a stone at her. Goes back down, starts writing on the ground again. And one by one, they start feeling guilty for their own sins, and they leave until Jesus looks up again, and there's just the woman there. And he says, is there no one here to condemn you? She says, no, Lord, no one. And Jesus says, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. That's the end of the story. Terrific story. The favorite story, we know it's the favorite story because in every movie produced in Hollywood, you've got to have this story. But even Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, even though that's about Jesus' last hours on earth, he has to have a flashback when he remembers the story. Because you've got to have the story if it's a Jesus movie. So it's in all. The problem is, this story was not originally in the New Testament. It's now found in John chapter 7 and 8, but in fact it's not in our ancient manuscripts. It was only in the later manuscripts that it was found, and so it made it into the King James Bible, so it came into English, so everybody knows the story, but it's not original to the New Testament. It was added by a later scribe. That's a problem. Final, last 12 verses of Mark. Mark is my favorite gospel because there are lots of reasons. The ending is quite stark. Jesus has been crucified. He's buried by Joseph of Arimathea. On the third day, the women go to the tomb, and it's empty. Jesus isn't in the tomb, but there's a man there who tells them that Jesus has been raised. And the man tells them, go tell the disciples that he will meet them in Galilee. And then the text says, the women said nothing to anyone. They fled from the tomb, for they were afraid. That's it. That's the end. They didn't tell anyone. And Jesus didn't show up to anybody. That's it. It's over. So when you read this, you say, ay, 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 how can it end there? Didn't Jesus show up? Didn't they go tell the disciples? Well, scribes in the Middle Ages had exactly the same reaction. They copied the Gospel of Mark, they got to the end of it, and it says the women fled from the tomb, didn't say anything to anyone, for they were afraid, and the scribes said, ay, 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 it can't end there. And so they added 12 verses, in which the women go tell the disciples go to Galilee, Jesus talks with them there in Galilee, appears to them, and so you have a nice rounded ending. It ends then. Well, that ending was not originally in the Gospel of Mark. It was added by later scribes. But the King James translators didn't know that. And so in your King James Bible, you'll have those last 12 verses. But in modern translations, most modern translations either won't include it or they'll put it in brackets and tell you that it's not original, but it was added later. Okay, well, so if you want to know how Mark ended his Gospel, it rather matters. And so the King James doesn't give you that information. Let me just say something very quickly about later revisions and additions of the King James Bible. People who think that the King James Bible is the only Bible there is don't realize that, in fact, there are lots of King James Bibles. The King James was revised and still called the King James Bible. It was revised in 1613, where they made 413 changes. It was revised 150 years later in 1769, where they modernized the spelling and language. Modernized again in 1873. In 1982, the new King James Bible came out, where they got rid of all the these and thous, but left all the problems. The result is there are many thousands of differences among different King James Bible in spelling and punctuation, even though the wording has remained virtually intact, but the payoff is there's no one King James Bible. So if somebody says, you know, I just follow the King James Bible, you have to ask, well, which one do you follow? Because there are different ones. There are some later revisions and additions that have struck modern readers as somewhat humorous and interesting because of typographical mistakes in additions, some of which are in the exhibit over here. For example, the Unrighteous Bible, an edition done in 1653, 1 Corinthians 6:9 says, "Know ye not that the unrighteous shall inherit the kingdom?" Oh, that should encourage some activity. The Sin On Bible of 1716, where Jesus tells the woman caught in adultery, "Go and sin on more." Instead of no more, it's on more. The Vinegar Bible of 1717, they had titles for the different passages, and in this one, instead of the parable of the vineyard, is the parable of vinegar. Which, of course, you can get from a vineyard, but I don't think that's the point. The Lions Bible of 1804, 1 Kings 8:19, speaking to King David, "The son that shall come forth from thy lions," which is supposed to be loins. And then my favorite one, which is on display over here, I didn't know it was going to be on display before I picked it. It's sometimes called the Wicked Bible, or I prefer calling it the Adulterous Bible of 1631. They left out the negative in the 7th commandment, and so it now says, "Thou shalt commit adultery." This is the most popular Bible of all time. All right, so let me just draw two very obvious conclusions. The King James is one of the worst study Bibles that you can go to. If you want to know what the authors of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and the New Testament were trying to communicate, the King James is not a good study Bible because of all the problems that I've laid out for you. At the same time, it is one of the greatest classics of English literature and should be celebrated because of that. It not only affected the English language with its resonances and its vocabulary and its phrases and its sentences, it actually is quite beautiful to read. And so, in some ways, it's the worst Bible. In some ways, it's the best Bible. Thank you very much.